Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of the BG Independent podcast. I'm your host, Dustin Galish. I'm a video journalist with BG Independent, have been working with them for about 2 years now. But for those first 5 years, pretty much everything at BG Independent, from a content standpoint, has been David Dupont and Larson McLaughlin. So I sat down with them and had a great time, talked more about the origins of BG Independent, issue 1, and really what it means to be an independent journalist in the modern world. So without further ado, here's episode 1 of the BG Independent podcast. Day one of BG Independent getting started, what was the first story, and really what was the feeling in general about starting it? I mean, at this point, it was kind of like jumping off a cliff in many ways. So what was day one like, and sort of let's get to sort of where we are today from where we started, if you can get there in some ways.
Yeah, we started probably in December when we got together and sort of talked about it with Elizabeth and John Zibel, and said, okay, they had some vision of some local news site, which has been tried other places. One of the things other sites did not have were writers, reporters, and because of circumstances, Jan and I, who each in their own way had a reputation as journalists and reporters, as people who covered the community, they had people producing their content. Now I had left newspaper work, a few weeks before, probably about 6 weeks before, and had launched a Medium.com site and was writing on that. And when we did the first story, that actually appeared. We used the Medium site because the website wasn't launched, but we really didn't know. We did some entrepreneurship classes where we would talk, and people would say, "Well, what do you want to be in 5 years?" And it's like, we have no idea. Talk to me where you want to be next 5 hours, and maybe we have an answer for that. But it was not. Our first story was by Jan, and the headline is "School's Gay Straight Alliance Honored for Silence That Speaks Volume," and they received the Drum Major for Peace Award. And to me, I've always thought that was a fitting first story for us to have.
I think that's interesting, because sometimes you feel like it's almost like with the musicians, sometimes they talk about how like what started the band was the first song. That can sometimes be a really good representation of where you went for 20 years after that or something like that. And so it wasn't like sort of a going back to that story. Is that story still up? I'm not sure. So is everything that's ever been produced still up there, correct? Okay.
Well, and this goes back to the band. When you start a band, you might write that first song, but you got to have other things to fill out the set. What we did is we imported stuff from my Medium site. It probably, 8 stories. I wasn't real productive on that site. I would write 2 or 3 things a week, and I'm not sure how much I wrote after we decided to form BG Indie. And it was a lot of music stuff. There were a couple good substantive pieces that were on that site. So those are on the site as well.
For me, it was really scary starting this, because I had done nothing other than work at a traditional newspaper. So this was a real leap for me and for us doing this together as a business. Neither one of us are particularly business minded, though I will say David has become far more so than I have.
Well, that's one thing. Some people might think that this is a nonprofit organization, or that this is sort of a labor of love, and it was at the beginning. It is a for-profit. It's a business. It's set up that way, and so I think. How was that sort of affected? Do you think that was what was more scary about it too at the beginning?
Actually, no, because at that point, David and I both had spouses that were gainfully employed and who feel strongly about supporting local journalism. So while it's been nice to be making some money off of it, it's not. It's definitely not the motivating factor for either of us.
So let's go to that then. Like, really, what is the motivating factor to do this, right? I mean, I sort of, in some ways, it was, I need a job, or I want to keep writing and being a journalist. There's that aspect, but what really is the reason to do this at this point? I feel like you probably have a pretty good idea now after doing it.
Well, I think it's to provide, quality coverage of the community we live in. And in a way, this has always been my ideal, is to sort of be a local journalist, on the street, talking to the people I meet every day. And that for me is the motivating factor, as well as covering the arts, which, has been a passion of mine, again, since I started and how I got into the business.
This is what I've wanted to do my whole life, is to write about my community. And I think what makes this a little bit different with David and I involved is that we're traditional trained journalists. We're not just, I don't want to say that it's not quality, if it's just a member of the community typing things up, but we've been educated and worked for years as working journalists, and know how to separate ourselves from the news as much as it's possible.
Yeah, I think what also makes it interesting is, though Jan emphasizes how much we're alike, we're actually, our backgrounds are we have some differences that gives, I think, really adds a special chemistry to it. As she said, she worked for the same source for 30 years. I worked for that source for 20 years, but I had years before that, and even when I've always had a side hustle. I wrote about music extensively and did freelance. So I always had that sort of sense of the business side. And as I've told many people, I used to walk back and forth to work about 1.5 miles, and once I'm thinking, and I realized I had written over the course of my career well over 1 million words, and I own the rights to none of them. The publishers, the people who published them, even if they were no longer publishing, still owned my rights. And I thought, is there some way for writers and reporters to have the rights and maybe get some benefit from them? Because I got to feeling in the traditional setup of a newspaper, the reporters were treated, they were treated as just another department, and we were told that there are other people we have to worry about besides you. But people weren't buying the newspaper for necessarily to look at the ads. Some of them were, but they were buying the newspaper because of the content we produced. Mm-hmm. And I got to feeling like, man, I had all these people I was carrying, and I'm not sure I need all those people to be carrying. And there might be a more efficient, streamlined way where the reporters, the writers, were in control.
Do you think that's something that's interesting to me? And I've heard you mention that before, that idea of owning your work. I think that's something most people don't really ever think about, sort of, and probably some even journalists don't think about that until you're 10 years into it, and you're like, oh no, I don't own any of this, or it's complicated, or like you're saying, some of these, as we know, the printed paper is dying in a lot of different ways, and so those were businesses that no longer exist now too. And so, was there a case where you were almost losing work? Was that something you had come across with other journalists, where it does become almost a ghost town of sort of just stories that there's really no place for and are just completely gone? I mean, unless you kept the newspaper or you scanned it or something, there's really no resource for that kind of stuff.
Actually, I worked for an alternative weekly, wrote for alternative weekly as a freelancer, as one of the many side jobs I had. I have no idea where some of that work is, and some of that was my earliest best work. It was in many ways more consistently things I was proud of than the publications who hired me full time. I think going back to music, my concern about rights really comes from my background in music, because from the very get-go it was drilled into us that musicians had to own the rights to their songs, because that's where that's where the money was in the royalties. And it was interesting to me that, you get into journalism and nobody cares about that, because a journalist is so used to being part of an industry. And I'm different because I came in and I had a sense of, well, do we need to be part of this whole corporate thing, where we're just one cog, even though we're an essential cog, but we don't get really. We're specifically told, well, you're no special snowflake.
Well, in many ways, aren't we living at sort of this is a golden age of independent reporting in many ways, being able to self-produce, self-write, self-publish. There seems to be more of that now. And so you guys, not to say you weren't, like ahead of the curve, but you guys seem to have a good timing of when you decided to do this too.
Oh.
You weren't the only ones having this idea, like you said before. And so what's something that I guess, has that allowed you to be more creative? Certainly in choices, you have almost complete freedom to choose what you write about, which has to be great.
Yeah,
you don't have someone sort of dictating deciding what they think is important. You get to make that choice yourself.
Right, but we also have to consider what readers want.
Sure.
And I sometimes think, well, I probably would be writing more opinionated pieces if I was out there on my own. But without this structure, I would be making no money. And that's the big challenge.
Sure.
The big challenge is, how do you turn this in to make a living income? And I think at this point, we're a little shy of that.
Sure.
We made great progress. We've gotten great support from advertisers and supporters, and that's been great. We need to move it to the next level. I like to say that, when we started this, I started it anticipating having no income and had prepared for that. Jan had a job with a real salary, and it's, she's not making that back. I'm making far more than I anticipated. She's making far less than she would in another situation.
I've always thought of journalists as public servants, and you were talking about being able to cover whatever we want. There is a great freedom to that, but like David said, I feel a great responsibility to cover things that our community should know about, like a zoning meeting or a utilities meeting that no one else wants to sit through, but I should be there just in case. And I still believe that most of our local public officials have good intentions, but I also believe that it really helps to have a reporter with a notebook sitting in the same room that helps them make the right decisions.
That's interesting. I never really thought about that too. I mean, when I joined you all, 2 years ago and doing video work now, it's sort of, my brain sometimes struggles with the scope of what it means. Like how do you decide what to cover? And both of you obviously working in a newsroom, you got accustomed to certain things that this town likes to know about or needs to, and I think that helps, right? I think it'd be way different if you had two people, 20, even more my age, who just starting from scratch. Like, I have this idea, I just want to be an independent journalist. Let me go. It's a little overwhelming. So how do you sort of make do with that idea of like creating what is sort of a regimen? Because that's really what people are coming back for, is consistency. And I think in news reporting, that's what you want. Certain expectations to see a certain thing every week. And the new stuff, because news is different every day, but there are certain things that happen all the time. So what was that struggle like, or how did you figure that out? Because it seems like it was...
With me, it takes a lot of self-discipline, and that's gotten harder this past year as I've gone through cancer and the treatments with that, because I just can't push myself in a way that I used to. So that's been really annoying. But you just can't. I'm sure David and I have very different ways of approaching this, but writer's block, you just don't have time for writer's block. you have to get beyond it because there's an news is something that's fairly fresh most of the time. So that would be an interesting podcast right there, just how to get beyond writer's block, different strategies. But
no, I mean, just staring at a story. You showed up to an event, you took a couple pictures, you interviewed some people. That was the easy part in some ways, right? I mean,
Right.
correct, right? That's sort of, I mean,
Right.
unless you have social anxieties or something, that could be harder. But at some point, as a writer, it's really when you take all that information and what you observe for the day and trying to figure out where to even start with that. And I think to do that every day is pretty staggering. It's like it's like a comedian writing a new bit every day. It's not always going to be great, but sometimes you're going to hit. But just you did it every day. There's a discipline to that. Have you felt like you've gotten stronger doing this than what your previous work was? Is there more pressure now, or is it less? How does that sort of work?
Certainly, I think the pressure is that this is really, of late we've had, you've come on and you've done work, and Julie has come on and she's done work for us, and that's, you've joined us. But for those first 5 years, it was the Jan and Dave show.
Yeah.
It was us, and we were the face of it, and there was so much more personal responsibility, personal identification with BG Independent News that was a pressure and an expectation that we're going to cover stuff, and that's there is a lot of pressure. Jan is I have to say a much faster writer than I am. That's something people don't understand. All they think about is when you're out in public. They say, "Oh, you off covering something? Oh, where are you off covering now?" And it's like, you're right. That's not the hard part. The hard part is coming back. I rely much more on tape than Jan does. And
so I'm assuming Jan's more notes then, so that you're writing a lot, right? Just sort of
right.
in that
She's
place,
younger
yeah.
than I am, so I
Better hands at this point.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for you, I guess, how have you taken on what that? I guess what was seen as seemed like a pressure, because for me, also you're under the gun, a sense of time. This is something I learned working in BG at the BG News years ago, was that just that pressure of having to produce something every day.
Yeah.
You have to make compromises for sure.
Yeah.
We can all sort of revise, come back to it, make it better. But I think in the news world, there's not a whole lot of time for that. So how do you make that work? I mean, what is the fine line? And do you have times to sort of have longer pieces that can exist outside of that world that you're proud of, or is that a thing you've done as well?
Well, I got used to the deadlines by working in daily. I mean, I would write every day. I would try to have at least one story a day done. And there, at a newspaper, there are those deadlines of the press running, when everything has to be paginated. So there were outside deadlines that you had to meet. Right now, we have these self-imposed deadlines, and I try to make it a goal of mine to have something up late at night, so when people wake up in the morning, there's something fresh there for them to see. David does far more longer pieces, in depth. I'm more of grunt work.
No, that's actually a good way to say it. Yeah, because there is that aspect of news. It's not sexy or something. Really, it's sort of or super exciting or fun. It sort of is just grunt work. It's information. You know what I mean? And that's a part of it you forget about. I think a lot of news can be focused on just sort of the flashy and the exciting stuff, right? Where I think that's one of the reasons why BG Independent has been successful, because there is that aspect of it too. It isn't just pictures and stories. There is that sort of just tough information where you're just sitting there and writing things down and reporting it. So like obituaries, that's another one too. Or just Dave, you had mentioned before, is that something you usually handle, right? That's sort of like
well, Elizabeth does that.
Does that? Okay.
Elizabeth does it. I post it on Facebook.
Oh, I see. Okay.
But she is the one who goes, and that's something I think within the past year and a half, 2 years, we put more emphasis on. There again, it was a response from the community. We met someone, I was out Linda and I were walking in Winter Garden, and somebody came up. Do you post obituaries? And we had posted obituaries for a long time. I did not put them on Facebook.
Sure.
You know, and a lot of people rely on Facebook, which is something I'm not all that pleased with, but a lot of people access our work through Facebook, and we started putting them on Facebook, and it's been, people like to see that.
Yeah, when did that transition start? That was not the gate, obviously, where the Facebook. You were trying to attempt to be a standalone at the beginning,
I think
correct? Or did you always have something correlated
We always
there?
did Facebook.
Okay.
Facebook is,
That makes sense. I think we're up to 10,000. I think 10,000 followers now. So that's sort of, how many years has that been?
It's 7.5.
7.5. Yeah. So you're thinking at that. You're looking at
Yeah, we even
1,100 a year or
before
something.
In the weeks before we launched, we used Facebook. We used Facebook for that. Yeah.
Well, that's something that I'll talk about now too, which is segue into like the video stuff too, because I think for me it was important. Just a lot of the news I consume is in the video format, and it isn't always just talking heads or it was podcasting, documentary style stuff, things like that. And I think YouTube has made that possible for us because that's an undertaking, right? As an independent website, hosting your own videos, and doing all this stuff. There's a lot of servers, there's all this complications, and working with John Zibble and trying to figure that out. It's unique to have something like YouTube that's beneficial to us because it can be spread across phones. You can text the link. It works great within our site. We haven't really any issues outside. I think if you remember a few weeks or a month ago, there was a point where all our videos stopped working. It was a YouTube thing. It was very strange. Yeah, I don't know. We didn't do anything actually. If I found out, I asked John, I was like, "What happened? You fixed it?" He's like, "I didn't do anything." I'm like, "What's fixed?" He goes, "Well, perfect." So
yeah.
But that's what I'm trying to get at is that reliance on still, although you're independent, you're using some other resources to help make this work. And I think Facebook and YouTube at this point have been probably the most successful uses of that. And if certain people are listening, subscribing to our YouTube page helps as well. It's just another way to get our stories. But yeah, is that something? Is that what held back some of the video before? Is that a thought you had, or how to even use it? I mean, sort of when I came in to pitch the idea in some ways.
I think we had Ryan Dick. Do you remember him? I think he did video, and I think but they were on his site.
Okay. Were those more like informational videos? I mean, you mentioned that before, where it was like that's another thing too.
He did some campus. He did. He was focused on campus. I think he works for a TV station now. He's really gone on. He's been one of their successful graduates. And we've used. He was actually never an intern. He was a freelancer for it. So we just paid him, and we've had several interns.
Is that so important to you all, or sort of how does that play into everything?
I mean, it's while it's important to us to work with a younger generation, it's also a challenge in that it's usually more effort than we get out of it in terms of good stories, because they're new and we don't have. I mean, it's just it was just the two of us.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is what we realized is we need, and the interns we had most recently, Andrew Bailey, who is now up with Channel 11.
I think so.
Yeah. Is that we really needed the best students. And often, especially during the school year, those students are busy with the media, with Falcon Media there. Sure. Yeah. So it was a problem. But the last few we had were very good. And both Jan and I have backgrounds in teaching. I've taught at the community college level, probably at least a half a dozen different places as I've moved around the country. Jan taught at BGSU. So we're good on that. But it's sometimes, it takes, for an intern to turn a story around. Sometimes I'm almost spending as much time coaching them as I would be doing the story myself. Yeah. And it is, when you have somebody good and is really interested in learning this stuff, that's satisfying. And I think that's good. That's not always the case. If they come in and they're not ready, that's just drudge work. And you feel like, well, the university should be paying me. But I also have we also were hesitant because, frankly, I don't believe in people working for free.
Yeah.
I don't think having an intern taking the place of a full-time reporter is, frankly, ethical.
All right, so for me, I kind of want to segue into the idea of focusing on what we consider to be really important issues that we're covering. That's going to be going over the next couple of weeks, or that we already worked on before. I think when I initially talked to you all about doing this idea, it was kind of like a little bit of talking about stuff that slips through the cracks, but also talking about things that are coming up that we think people should be paying attention to. So for me, I want to talk to you, Jan, specifically about issue 1, what that means here in Bowling Green, Wood County, the state of Ohio, and what your reporting has sort of brought to light at this point for you, and what you're seeking to continue to cover as we get closer to this date, which is coming up very soon, actually.
Okay. Well, issue 1 is the only issue on the August 8th ballot, and it comes on the heels of the state legislature deciding last year that there shouldn't be any state issues on the August ballot because of the low voter turnout, which averages like 7% of the voters. Something changed their minds earlier this year, and they wanted issue 1 put on in August, and if passed, it would require 60% of the voters to pass any citizen-initiated constitutional amendments to the state constitution.
Yeah, and another thing that's sort of the main point. Another thing is to get it on, it would increase the petition requirements. So you'd have to get signatures from all 88 counties.
Correct, and it's just half correct now. It's just the 44, and that's how it's been.
Yeah, and you have to get a certain percent of those, and that's
so each county you have to get you're required to get a certain amount of percent of that, whatever, how many people live in that county, right? That's how it's determined.
And then each county board of elections has to approve it, and not to think there's any funny business with the petitions. What's telling to me is that in these days of strict party line issues, that so many of our former governors and attorneys general have come out against issue 1, Republicans and Democrats. They, for a host of reasons, and we had a story last week talking with Betty Montgomery, who was the state attorney general. She used to live in Wood County and was our county prosecutor for a while. And she was just really worried about what this would mean for Ohio if it passed.
I mean, the danger really is it's decisions being led by the minority, right? So that in itself is anti-democratic, which is
right.
That's how that feels, right, man? So you're letting the minority dictate what choice you have to even decide on what you want to vote for, let alone even voting for it. I think that's how I was perceiving at this point, because what we're talking about is we're not even voting for something; it's the potential to vote for things.
Yes, right, and we're voting at a time when so few voters are engaged. So,
how much has been addressed to increase the awareness, to increase turnout? Because it seems like that at this point, that's why I want to talk about it, because it seems to be that's really the only way to fix this idea that's been put out. Because it seems like that side who's put it out there wants there to be low turnout. That's the whole point.
I don't know. I am seeing more
in some
and
ways,
more.
Just because that's the tradition. Why would you not think otherwise?
Right. I'm seeing more and more advertisements from the vote yes people.
Correct. Yeah, so that's what I'm trying to understand. Yeah, sort of. I haven't seen as much just signage or verbiage or even funding to try to combat that at this point, and seems not really understanding why. And so it's sort of.
Well, I think there's also probably efforts going outside the public view. I received an email, and for some reason I get lots of emails from both sides. And this was offering messaging to pastors to speak in favor of issue 1.
Okay.
Because this was caused by the proposal to add to the state constitution of reproductive rights.
Correct.
And the right to an abortion, and
Well,
that's why they did it in August. I think they were probably hoping they could put off the abortion decision, later. It's going to happen in November. So even if this passes, my understanding is it's not going to be in effect in the next election.
Okay.
But it was certainly aimed at that.
Okay.
So I think there's stuff going on under the surface. It seems like, at least on the state, and we rely on our, for a lot of our state coverage, but with the Ohio Capitol Journal, which is part of a national newsroom program that has state house coverage in states across the country. There are well over 20 states across the country that have states newsroom operations, and we're able to use their stories free of charge. It's not like AP where we have to subscribe. So we use their stories, and we hope it just gives another dimension. We've used them for about 3-4 years since they started, and I think it adds another dimension. It frankly doesn't drive much traffic.
Sure.
But
it's an important resource.
It's available.
Yeah.
So what I find particularly troubling, and it happens on both sides of issues, but I'm seeing more and more ads, billboards to vote yes for issue 1, asking people to protect Ohio's Constitution. And I have to ask myself, who are they protecting it from? Is it citizens? I mean, it's
very misleading. I think that's what I've seen. What I think it's very important to talk about is that the wording itself is confusing. It's vague. It's sort of based on what you're saying. I think it's like it's protect the Constitution by changing it, right? Even that in itself is actually a sort of a. And it's contradicting itself in that same way. I've
left multiple messages with staff at our state senator, Teresa Gaverone's office, and have yet to get a call back from her about issue 1. She did issue a press release last week, I think, about the issue, but that isn't the same. I mean, you can't ask any questions through a press release.
Correct.
But in that press release, she talks about how if issue 1 isn't passed, Ohio could soon look like California and New York. But that's just ludicrous because it's already hard to get a citizen-initiated issue passed.
I think Ohio historically it's hard, especially in Ohio, right? We're not big on change in some ways, right?
Right. Well, in 110 years, there have been more than 70 of them proposed.
Okay.
And on the ballots, but only 19 have been approved by voters. So it's already hard to get this passed. This issue 1 would make it almost impossible.
Right, yeah.
I mean, both people from both parties agree on that.
Well, in many ways, it's really putting the hands within just the Ohio government, right? And that's what we're saying. In theory, what you're saying is, hey, the legislative area of the state government is really making decisions on what you're allowed to vote for,
right?
As opposed to letting you decide the things that you would like to vote for, which I think,
And we have voted for those legislators.
Correct. That's correct. Yeah. I think that's, to me, I think initially when I heard of when it came up, the issue with issue 1, but the idea is that it just felt misleading. And I think in the end, if it felt more honest, that's why I want us to talk about it. Because I think as journalists, it's important for people to make it clear what you're actually voting for. Because that's tough, and that's what a journalist's job is, to try to, if there is misleading information, because politics has a history of that, to kind of get through that and just let people know this is what you're actually voting on. Because even now, like my wife, I was talking the other day, I was like, remember what you're voting for, sort of. And she's like, yeah, yes, no, maybe. It's like, it's just such a vague, weird, it almost feels weird voting no for something, like when you almost feel like you should be voting yes for something. So
right, who can vote against the
Constitution? Yeah, it's a very, and obviously that's sort of, traditionally that's been done, especially in our state with a lot of issues or things have come up. The wording has always been very strange. I think when the initial marijuana recreation bill was out, the wording was very strange too, if I remember, where most people just didn't even vote on it, because I don't even know what I'm voting for too. So this seems more in that Ohio has a history of trying to make their voters confused, which I don't understand. So I think, so what can we do to help with that, I guess?
And I think an earlier version of that was locally was the Human Rights Ordinance. And to vote yes, and how many years ago was that?
Boy, I don't remember,
but it was
for the one here in Bowling Green, correct? You're talking about,
and okay. it was the council passed this ordinance, involving gay rights, and it was put in, and then there was people petitioned to have it rescinded. So to vote in favor of the Human Rights Ordinance, you had to vote no against this, because this would have repealed it. And that was. It survived. It actually is a case where it survived on the college vote. I remember that was a very close, tense night, and my son was working at a local restaurant, and people were down because they said, "Oh, it's behind," and local politician, and I think he was GOP chair then, Mike Marsh, who's city attorney, said, or used to be city attorney, former city attorney, said, "No, it's going to pass. The districts that are out, they haven't counted the student districts yet. It's going to pass," and it certainly did. But it was very close. It was too close.
It's always tough to think about how do you approach this from do you feel like there's a point where being a journalist, and we'll kind of wrap with this, of like, how do you divide between opinion and your feelings and trying to be almost not having opinion at all? I think there's a point, in history that was almost a journalist's job, was to almost not have an opinion. Your job was just to present what existed and then let our readers, interpret that. And so I think I've always enjoyed that about your guys' work. I try to do that with my work as well, where I'm not presenting things as they are is still the most powerful tool. And do you feel like you have to struggle with that sometimes because you feel like news in general is moving away from that? It's about feeling, or it's about making people get angry about things, or dividing. And I've never really caught BG Independent in that space. It does feel more old school in that, as a compliment, not just
I think we both came up with the fair and balanced. What they say they used to have it on the news on our notepads, fair and balanced and concise. I don't know. And what changed with that is politicians just frankly realizing they can just lie, and if they lie enough, people are going to believe them. I think the biggest change came when NPR just said flat out, a certain former president would say something, and when they say, "No, that's a lie," that's just not true. Sorry. And being put into that position has sort of forced us, and you can see it with other groups like the League of Women Voters, which used to be the nonpartisan, and we're getting different terms, but sort of the balanced, fair group of people. How can you be against the League of Women Voters? Mm-hmm. Well, now politicians are deciding they don't have to show up for their forums. Now, because the League of Women Voters, who believe in access and democracy, now we're taking stands on things like Issue 1. Mm-hmm. And that's making them seem like they're taking, like they're partisan and they're taking a side. And that only bolsters the side of the people who sort of want the truth to be whatever they say it is.
Well, thank you guys so much. I think we'll kind of wrap it up here. I think this was a good way to get this sort of ball rolling on and doing something what is considered a podcast, but really just having conversations, more long form ideas, letting people know a little bit more about what you guys are doing, because it's like people take things for granted sometimes. It's sort of, I was talking the other day about how downtown we had a construction, a couple years ago, where there was all a mess, everything was destroyed. And we walk down there now and just, oh, this is great. And you're like, oh, that's right, this was a mess a couple years ago. This was such a pain in the ass, But I think in some ways, you take for granted something like BG Independent almost, oh, this is always here, and that's not the case. It's still kind of a new idea, and it's a new thing. And so I just want to help people be more aware of what y'all are doing, what we're doing here, and just trying to help support that more. And there's a lot of ways that people can do that. And so thank you guys so much for doing this.
Very good. And I got to talk with John Lennon's mistress. So there are, it's not, it's all not, it's all.
That's true. That wasn't true. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, she's older than I am, but
Sure.
and that story will be forthcoming.
Good. All right.
That's one of those long stories that takes time.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much. I appreciate it.